CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says it would be absurd if his country is not invited to become a member of NATO. But Russia says it'll respond appropriately if Sweden and Ukraine join the military alliance. Kyiv and Odessa come under fire in the latest Russian drone attacks, but nearly all the weapons are shot down before landing. And the Solomon Islands opens its first embassy in China a day after the two countries strengthened their diplomatic ties. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says it would be absurd if his country is not invited to become a member of the security alliance NATO. He made his comments as leaders of the Western military alliance began their summit in Lithuania that could shape the direction of the conflict in Ukraine and the future of NATO. Their meeting started with fresh momentum after Turkey decided to lift its opposition to Sweden joining the alliance. But there is still disagreement over Kyiv's ambitions for membership. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent John Beaver in the capital, Vilnius. John, what's been the reaction today about the inclusion of Sweden?
Well, NATO very keen to sell this as a major win. This was all signed off late last night, just after 11 o'clock local time here, actually before the summit officially got underway this morning. But yes, NATO saying that this shows that Russia's strategy has failed, and that when it invaded Ukraine, if it was hoping to divide NATO allies, then they've got that wrong, and it's just showed that NATO has strengthened. Of course, Finland joined the bloc a few months ago. Sweden will be the next to join after the disagreements between Ankara and Stockholm were put to one side. There's been some talk that possibly an American deal about F-16 fighters was back on the table and being discussed, and that maybe is why President Erdogan might have changed his mind. But very much NATO selling this as a win, and it was something that the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was keen to highlight. We can hear what he had to say.
This summit is already historic. Because the agreement we made yesterday will make Sweden a full member of NATO. And that will make our alliance even more capable of defending all allies. At this meeting, we will also send a clear message to Ukraine that we stand by them as long as needed, and also that we agree on united and positive message on the path forward for Ukraine and membership for Ukraine.
NATO Secretary General speaking a little earlier. John, if we can put Sweden to one side for the moment and talk about Ukraine's membership, which is also, as we heard there, high on the agenda, and President Zelensky pulling no punches.
No, he's not, and he's due in town tomorrow and due to be speaking to people and very much making his presence felt. Now, in a tweet that he sent out whilst he says he was on his way here, he said that Ukraine deserves respect. It's absurd when a time frame is not set, and went on to say it seems there is no readiness to invite Ukraine to NATO. So as you say, he's pulling no punches in terms of wanting to make sure that NATO has a clear path, Ukraine, has a clear path forward for joining NATO. Of course, NATO allies are disagreeing on the best way forward for that. Some very aware that they don't want to antagonise Russia further. Others saying, well, look, if we said to Ukraine that they could join as soon as fighting has finished with Russia, then actually Russia might never officially declare an end to the fighting. So it perversely gives Russia a sort of a veto in terms of stopping Ukraine from entering NATO. So the these are very complex discussions that are, I would be surprised if they get resolved over the next few days, but certainly everyone here is going to be doing all they can to try and come up with a compromise that suits everybody.
John, thank you for that. Our correspondent John Beaver, ill in Vilnius. Well, people in Sweden have been giving their reaction to Turkey supporting their entry into NATO.
As a Swede, I have always been proud of being in a neutral country, and the things we could do with not being members of an organizations like NATO. Then again, I don't know if it's that big of a difference. But as a father, I think about my sons now. If they are joining the army or something, they can be sent away in a different way than we had before. So that I think about, and I think it's a bit worrying.
I think it was a bit of a surprise. I thought Erdogan would milk it for more stuff than he previously did. But I guess the pressure from the rest of the world, especially the States, made him cave in. I'm not sure if it's good for Sweden or bad for Sweden, but it seems like a popular choice, at least for now.
Well, Russia said it will respond appropriately if Sweden and Ukraine join the NATO alliance. The Kremlin says the expansion of NATO into the Nordic region will have negative implications for Russian security. Let's talk to our correspondent, Dasha Chernashova in Moscow. Dasha, these are responses, comments from the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. What has he been saying altogether?
Well, that's right. As we have heard from Sergei Lavrov, Russian Foreign Minister, Moscow is surprised at how quickly Sweden and Finland have both abandoned their neutral status. He suggested that this neutral status has been given them a lot, including a reputation. They also suggested that the special relations between Moscow and Helsinki and Moscow and Stockholm are now over, and was saying that the speed of the NATO entry by these two countries is forcing Russia to think of how these two countries have become the subordinates of the United States. So certainly he has been reassuring about the political implications for these two countries, and of course once again saying that these two countries are losing their sovereignty. But also he was talking about the security guarantees that Moscow will be forced to ensure if Sweden is becoming yet another member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Let's listen in.
Helsinki and Stockholm are already discussing with the United States issues related to deployment of alliance infrastructure right near Russia's borders in case of Finland, and not far away from our borders when it comes to Sweden. Let me assure you that all legitimate security interests of the Russian Federation will be protected, and we know which measures to take and to practically employ.
Dasha, in terms of Ukraine's possible NATO accession, the Kremlin has also been talking about that too.
Well, indeed, as you remember, the membership of Ukraine in the NATO alliance is a red line for Moscow. Moscow has been saying that it is the idea that Ukraine can one day become the member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that has brought the world to the current situation. The Kremlin has also been saying that it is closely monitoring the outcomes and the discussions that are now held in Vilnius, and certainly Moscow will be going through a thorough analysis of all those decisions. But also Moscow has been reminding that it is not the Russian military infrastructure that has been getting closer to the Western European countries, but quite the contrary. And that's why Moscow insists that certainly NATO should not be taking Ukraine as a member state, because certainly that would be destroying the already suffering security architecture in Europe. So certainly Moscow is following the developments in Lithuania and will be taking the appropriate measures.
Dasha, thank you for that. Our correspondent Dasha Chernashova with the view from Moscow. Jamie Shea is the former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. Jamie, welcome back. Good to see you. Well, first of all, I guess, realistically, what are you expecting to come out of this NATO summit?
Good afternoon, Jamie, and thank you for having me back on the show. Well, I think, first of all, you'll see a tightening up of NATO's collective defence arrangements. You mentioned Sweden joining the alliance. That will improve NATO's posture in the Baltic area and Northern Europe. You've got this commitment that the allies have now agreed to raise defence spending, to make the 2% of GDP rule the minimum rather than the maximum, and on more or less an open-ended permanent basis. You've got some new regional defence plans which will make it much clearer what each individual ally needs to do in order to play its full part in the collective defence of NATO Europe. You've also got, by the way, nobody's really talked about this very much, but for NATO it's significant, a meeting with 4 Asia-Pacific countries tomorrow. The leaders of Japan, South Korea, New Zealand and Australia are going to be in Vilnius as well. Now, obviously, the whole debate does reverberate around Ukraine, and I expect that NATO tomorrow will give Ukraine a fairly significant package to upgrade the relationship, weapons, long-term interoperability programs. Certain allies will give these bilateral security assurances for the long run to build up the Ukrainian army that President Zelensky is seeking, an accelerated process of integration by ditching NATO's membership action plan, which could have slowed the whole thing down, and this new NATO-Ukraine Council, which will meet for the first time with Zelensky. I'm not saying Zelensky himself is going to be perfectly satisfied, but nonetheless, this is really going to move the NATO-Ukraine cursor significantly forward.
Turkey has agreed to back Sweden as a NATO member. I wonder what force does this add to the alliance?
Well, it certainly, as your correspondents rightly said at the beginning, allowed NATO to put on a good show of unity. If Sweden, for the second summit in a row, Jamie, had not been able to sort of join the alliance, it would have been, I think, a bit of a PR setback for NATO. This whole issue has been rumbling on for some time, and Sweden's neighbour Finland has been in NATO for several months already. So I think the fact that Erdogan has now done, if you like, the magnanimous thing helps NATO considerably. Do not forget that Hungary also has to ratify Sweden's membership as well, but that shouldn't prove to be too difficult. It also allows NATO commanders now to go ahead and finalise their military plans for the defence of Northern Europe. And of course, it does put the focal point, now that Sweden is joining NATO, on the country that still wants to get in, and that's Ukraine.
Turkey, of course, seeking to try and upgrade its F-16 flight. What challenges, what issues does that cause?
Well, I think the Biden administration would like to go ahead because initially the idea was that the US would sell Turkey F-35 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft. That became impossible after Turkey concluded many defense agreements with Russia, for example, to purchase the Russian S-300 air defense system. So Turkey has fallen back on 40 modern F-16 aircraft. The Biden administration would like to go ahead as a show of goodwill to Turkey. These planes, of course, will also reinforce NATO's southern flank. But the issue is really with the Congress, both Democrats and Republicans in Congress, who are worried about the impact on Greece, another important ally, and who feel that Turkey should really distance itself more from Russia and cancel some of its agreements to buy Russian military equipment before they're willing to sell the F-16. So I think the real question now is whether the Biden administration can convince Congress that Turkey has done enough to merit being allowed to have these 40 F-16s. So watch this space.
We will. Jamie, thanks for that. Good to see you. Jamie Shea, former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. Well, buildings have been damaged, but no casualties reported after Russia launched drone strikes on Ukraine. The capital, Kyiv, and the port city of Odessa came under fire in the overnight attacks, just hours ahead of this Vilnius NATO summit. Let's talk to our correspondent, Stephanie Freed in Kyiv. Stephanie, so more drone attacks overnight. What's the latest you're hearing from Odessa and where you are in Kyiv?
Well, Jamie, there were 28 drones, according to Ukraine officials that were launched at Ukraine, and all but 2 of those were intercepted by Ukraine. That's a huge interception rate. 2 that got through hit Odessa, specifically the port of Odessa Administrative Building, as well as a grain silo there. And that, according to the Black Sea deal that was struck last year, which allows or enables Ukraine to ship grains out of the port at Odessa, major port for shipping grains, not allowed, not okay. Ukraine says that 22 of those 28 drones were fired on Odessa. So that high interception rate coming at perfect timing, because the word is now that Ukraine's about to get a package weapons deal or a package of weapons from Germany that includes tanks, Patriot interceptors, 20,000 rounds of 155 millimeter artillery, and Luna drone systems, which are German-made. They track and detect incoming drones a lot. And, you know, Jamie, when we were speaking earlier, you were asking about this behind me. This doesn't intercept drones, but what is behind me, those are Hedgehogs. We're about a block away from the Parliament building, and up to, I'd say, a few months ago, these were scattered around. They stopped tanks. They would stop tanks, APCs, anything coming through since the start of the campaign. They were scattered throughout the city for that purpose. Only now are they sort of here, collected behind me, waiting for possibly being put back into use. Jamie.
Stephanie, thank you for that. Our correspondent Stephanie Freed in Kyiv. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the Solomon Islands opens its embassy in China, strengthening diplomatic ties between the two countries. And why, when it comes to equal opportunities, the United Nations says it's still a man's world.
Roger, Ricky, loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come, and this idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome! We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said it would be absurd if his country is not invited to become a member of NATO. But Russia says it will respond appropriately if Sweden and Ukraine join the military alliance. Kyiv and Odessa come under fire in the latest Russian drone attacks, but nearly all of the weapons are shot down before landing. The Solomon Islands has opened its embassy in China just one day after the two countries strengthened diplomatic ties. Our correspondent Lou Saru reports.
The Solomon Islands has opened its embassy in China on Tuesday, 4 years after it established diplomatic ties with China. Senior Chinese diplomat Wang Yi and Solomon Prime Minister Manasseh Sagavar attended the ceremony in Beijing. Sagavar said the opening of the embassy in China marks stronger ties between the two countries.
The opening of the embassy in Beijing puts to rest any doubt that Solomon Islands' relations with the People's Republic of China is firm and unshakable.
The Pacific Island nation severed ties with Taiwan in 2019 in favor of establishing diplomatic ties with Beijing. And on the same year, Sagavar visited the Chinese capital and joined the country's Belt and Road Initiative.
Next, we should work together to build high-level trust and high-quality cooperation between China and Pacific Islands nations.
4 years later, the Solomon Islands Prime Minister is visiting China again and hoping to build stronger ties. And on Monday, Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with Sogavare, and both of them agreed to develop a comprehensive strategic partnership between the two countries. And it's also expected that education and medical industry would be focused in the following people-to-people exchanges. Lu Sirui, CGTN, Beijing.
Protests have flared up in Israel again over controversial plans to overhaul the judicial system. Israeli demonstrators blocked highways, threw flares and clashed with the police, protesting against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's bill to reduce Supreme Court powers. The new bill won the first of 3 required votes on Monday. The United Nations is marking World Population Day, taking gender inequality as its focus this year. The world's population is projected to reach 9.7 billion by the year 2050. While women make up nearly half of the global population, they remain underrepresented in terms of education, reproductive rights and employment. And in India, the world's most populous country, the issue of women in the workforce is even more serious as numbers continue to fall, hitting record lows over the last 2 decades. Our correspondent Radhika Bajaj reports now from Mumbai.
A burgeoning population of 1.4 billion plus, of which 48% are women. But only 1 out of 5 women work in India, as per World Bank data from 2021. Women made up only 23% of India's formal and informal workforce that year, down from nearly 27% in 2005. Societal and family considerations often lead to them dropping out. And there are several other factors.
Families are not very sure of the security of at the workplace, lack of transport, lack of creche facilities, so many things. It's very important for a woman to have the right kind of ecosystem where she is able to work without any of these stresses and tensions.
It's not just women who lose out when they can't work. Achieving gender parity in workforce participation can boost India's GDP by 27%. Out of 146 countries, India ranked 135th in the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index of 2022. That's up 5 spots from 2021. The hope is that younger women with better education and ambitions to be financially independent will continue to join the workforce. And while continued societal and policy support is critical to enable them, immediate attention is also required towards another growing and vulnerable part of the Indian population, the elderly. Currently, 7% of Indians are above the age of 65 years. This will nearly double to touch 192 million by 2030. Non-governmental organizations working with elders say cases of elderly abuse and abandonment have been rising. While there are many government policies targeting the elderly, experts say they are largely tokenistic.
So on one hand, the policy draft makers are people who are young themselves. On the other hand, the politicians are not interested in old people as a vote bank. So therefore, there is very limited policy which comes out. 1. 2. Whatever policies are made more on paper. When we are talking in terms of ground realities are completely different.
Advocacy groups say it is critical that the silver generations are given every opportunity to be financially independent, whether it is through monetary government support or finding those willing, suitable jobs. Another area is high costs of healthcare and medicines. Most surveys show that for elders, this is a major expense. And what every stakeholder agrees on is that the time to address these issues and plan for the decades ahead is now. Radhika Bajaj, CGTN, Mumbai.
Well, let's talk to our distinguished guest, David Coleman, Professor of Demography at Oxford University. David, welcome. Good to see you. Let's just pick up on some of those themes from the film we've just watched, first of all. Let's talk about gender parity in this rather unequal world that we live in. How does the world make the world more equal for men and women?
It's a question of mixing changes in public opinion with changes in legislation. I don't like to rely upon legislation, but it has been very effective in Britain, generating equal pay for equal work, bringing up the pay gap to a much smaller level than it was before, and generally encouraging women in the workforce. So I'm afraid legislation does probably come first, but that tends to generate a change in public opinion, which is fundamental for keeping it going.
It's been suggested that population growth may be coming to an end and that the global population could start declining in the next 40 years or so. If we accept that, what's driving that?
Well, it's being driven by the realization that large family size is no longer a benefit, if it ever was. An understanding that family planning is available increasingly to more and more people in the world, and also probably some degree of overshoot. That in many parts of the world, population has grown rather too fast, rather too soon, and it's had a lot of negative feedback in terms of standard of living accommodation, pressure on resources. And this is a kind of negative feedback from it, which will correct itself in due course. But for the time being, the end of population growth is surely welcome. And some slow, modest population decline, probably a good thing, especially in the light of global climate change.
Well, you and I are obviously in the first flush of youth, but let's talk about the silver generation for a moment. I mean, how might a declining and ageing global population impact the world's economic model? I mean, what are the consequences and challenge that arise from that?
Well, it's obvious that when the population is declining, it also tends to go hand in hand with a greater number of people in older ages who tend to be consumers of wealth rather than generators of wealth, and so the efficiency of an economy deteriorates. This is an inevitable consequence of population aging, but it's not the end of the world. Partly because as long as people enter old age in a healthier and healthier condition, which for the most part they're doing, then they can continue working for longer into old age. And the old idea that everything stops at age 65 and then retirement and senescence start to kick in is very out of date. We need to question that wherever we find it.
David, good to see you. Thank you very much indeed for your expertise and your time. David Coleman, the Professor of Demography at Oxford University.
Thank you.
Bye. And finally, a South Korean zoo has welcomed the country's first giant panda twins. Aibao gave birth to 2 female cubs last Friday at a theme park near the capital, Seoul. Both mum and newborns are said to be in good health. These aren't Aibao's first cubs. 3 years ago, she gave birth to Fubao, the first panda to be born in South Korea. The headlines again. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says it would be absurd if his country is not invited to become a member of NATO. But Russia says it will respond appropriately if Sweden and Ukraine join the military alliance. Kyiv and Odessa come under fire in the latest Russian drone attacks, but nearly all the weapons are shot down, with 4 landing. And that is the world today. Thank you for watching. There's more news on CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app, or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone. We're back with more news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.